My name is Amelia, and I'm 28 years old. For most of my life, I believed my story was a simple, albeit sad, one. I was the adopted child in a family that never quite managed to love me. I spent nearly 3 decades trying to earn a place at a table where I was only ever given a seat out of a sense of duty. But one toast, a few careless, cruel words from the man I called my father, would unravel everything I thought I knew about myself and his precious family. What he intended as my ultimate humiliation turned out to be the key that unlocked a truth so staggering it would shatter his entire world and question the very definition of his legacy. Before I dive into the story of how a DNA test destroyed one family and built another, I want to say hello to everyone watching. Let me know where you're from in the comments below. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And if you've ever felt like an outsider, like you were on the fringes of a life you were supposed to be at the center of, please hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. This is a community for people who understand that sometimes the family you choose is more real than the one you're given. The house I grew up in wasn't just a house, it was a testament to the Mitchell name, a sprawling colonial revival with white columns that seemed to hold up the sky, set on acres of land so green and perfectly manicured. It looked like a carpet rolled out by God himself. My father, Richard Mitchell, was a man carved from the same granite as the statues in the town square. He was a third-generation titan of industry, his family's manufacturing firm a cornerstone of the state's economy. Everything about him was legacy, tradition, and bloodline. My mother, Eleanor, was the perfect accessory to his ambition, elegant, poised, and socially flawless, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, at least not when she looked at me. Then there were my siblings, Daniel and Sophie. Daniel, 2 years my senior, was the heir apparent, a younger, slightly softer-edged version of our father. Sophie, 3 years my junior, was the princess, doted on and adored, the living embodiment of Mitchell grace. And then there was me, Amelia. The footnote, the addendum, the adopted one. It wasn't something they ever let me forget, not through overt cruelty, but through 1,000 tiny daily cuts. It was in the way my mother would tell the story of my arrival, her voice tinged with a theatrical, tragic sigh. We had always wanted a third, she'd explain to friends over glasses of chilled Chardonnay. And after Sophie we couldn't, well, we felt it was our duty to give a home to a child in need. The subtext was always clear. I wasn't a choice born of desire, but a project born of charity. My existence was their good deed for the year. The story they told me was that I was a foundling, left at the hospital with no name and no history. They took me in, gave me the Mitchell name, but it always felt like a borrowed coat, one that was several sizes too big and never truly mine to wear. Birthdays were a masterclass in this subtle stratification. I remember my 10th birthday vividly. We were in the grand dining room, the table groaning under the weight of a cake large enough to feed a small army. Daniel had received a state-of-the-art telescope for his 12th birthday, a few months prior, something he'd circled in a catalog for weeks. Sophie's 7th birthday had involved a real pony, rented for the day, that trotted around the vast back lawn. My turn came, and I was handed a neatly wrapped, rectangular box. Inside was a set of classic novels. It was a lovely gift, an appropriate gift, but it was also a generic one. It was the kind of gift you give to a child you don't really know. A few minutes later, Richard cleared his throat and announced a surprise. A golden retriever puppy, complete with a bright red bow, was brought into the room. Sophie shrieked with delight, Daniel grinned, and they both fell upon the squirming animal. "We'll call him Winston," Richard declared. I remember asking, Is he for all of us? My mother patted my head, her touch as light and meaningless as a falling leaf. Don't be silly, dear. The puppy is for Daniel and Sophie. It'll teach them responsibility. I watched them, my brother and sister, and the new member of their exclusive club, and felt the familiar hollow ache of being on the outside of a window, looking in at a warmth I was not invited to share. His pattern repeated itself through my adolescence. When Daniel made the varsity football team, a banner was hung across the front porch. When Sophie was cast as the lead in the school play, my parents bought out half the tickets and threw a cast party at the house. When I won a statewide art competition, my painting earning a place in the governor's office for a year, my father looked at the certificate and said, "That's nice, Amelia. Just make sure you keep your grades up in the subjects that matter." My passion for art history was treated as a quaint, harmless eccentricity. "It's a lovely hobby," Eleanor would say, "but you need to think about a practical future. Not every path is as straightforward for people like you." The implication hung in the air. People without the proper bloodline had to be practical. Daniel was groomed for the family business, Sophie for a marriage that would amount to a strategic merger with another influential family. I was groomed for adequacy. I tried for so long. I really tried. I got perfect grades. I was captain of the debate team. I volunteered at the local soup kitchen. Each achievement was a desperate plea. See me, value me, love me as your own. And each time the response was the same polite, distant approval. It was like presenting them with a beautiful, handcrafted gift, only to have them thank you and put it in a drawer without ever opening it. The love in that house was a finite resource, and the lion's share had already been allocated to the true children. I was left to fight for the scraps, and I was starving. My only real solace, my only taste of unconditional love, had come from Richard's mother, my grandmother, Evelyn. She was a force of nature, a woman who wore bold colors and spoke her mind, a rogue element in the staid, beige world of the Mitchells. She saw me. When I showed her my paintings, she didn't call them a nice hobby. She'd look at them with a discerning eye and say, "Amelia, this is where your soul speaks. Don't ever let anyone silence it." She was the one who bought me my first professional set of oil paints, who snuck me books on Monet and Kahlo that my parents would have deemed frivolous. She passed away when I was 16, and with her went the only source of warmth in that cold, cavernous house. At her funeral, I overheard my mother talking to a cousin. "Evelyn always had a soft spot for strays," she'd said, and I knew she was talking about me. So when the invitation for the annual Mitchell family reunion arrived, a thick, cream-colored card embossed with the family crest, I considered for the first time not going. I was 28. I had my own apartment in the city, a small but fiercely independent life I had carved out for myself. I worked as a curator for a small, private art gallery, a job I loved, a job I had gotten with no help from my family, but the pull of duty, the lifetime of conditioning, was strong. To refuse would cause a scene, and I was, above all else, conditioned to be a good girl and not cause trouble. So I put on a brave face and a pretty dress and drove the 2 hours to the family estate, my stomach twisting with the familiar dread of impending invisibility. The day was as perfect and as suffocating as my childhood memories. The sun shone brightly on the rolling lawns, where distant cousins I barely knew played croquet. The air was thick with the scent of cut grass and expensive perfume. Daniel was there, insufferably smug, talking loudly about a recent promotion at the firm. Sophie was showing off a new, ridiculously large diamond on her ring finger, a gift from her equally wealthy fiancé. I tried to make conversation, to find my footing. I had recently curated a successful exhibit on Impressionist landscapes, and I brought a copy of the exhibition catalog as a gift for my parents. "Oh, how lovely, Amelia," Eleanor said, taking it from me. She flipped through a few pages with feigned interest before placing it on a side table, where it was soon buried under a pile of ladies' handbags. A few minutes later, Daniel presented Richard with a set of antique gold-plated cufflinks. Richard boomed with delight, holding them up for everyone to see. "Now that's a gift with class. A true Mitchell recognizes quality." He clapped Daniel on the shoulder, a gesture of deep, easy affection I had never once received. The day wore on, a symphony of small, painful slights. An uncle asked me if I was still single, with a pitying tone. An aunt patted my arm and said, "It must be so hard for you, dear, with your background." I was a ghost at the feast, a walking embodiment of their charity, a living, breathing testament to their magnanimity. I just had to get through it. I retreated into myself, counting the minutes until I could politely escape. Then came the toast. Richard, as the patriarch, stood on the veranda, his voice silencing the polite chatter. He held his crystal glass of champagne aloft, the sunlight catching it like a diamond. He looked out over the crowd, a king surveying his domain. "Family," he began, his voice resonating with power and pride. "It is everything. It is the bedrock on which we build our lives, our fortunes, our futures." He smiled, a genuine warm smile. I had only ever seen him direct at Daniel and Sophie. I look at my children, and I see the continuation of a legacy that began generations ago. A legacy of strength, of integrity, of success. His eyes scanned the crowd, passing directly over me as if I were a piece of furniture. He then raised his glass higher, his gaze locking with Daniel and Sophie, who stood beside him beaming. "So I ask you to join me in a toast, to the future of the Mitchell name, to my true legacy, a legacy carried on, as it always must be, by my blood." To Daniel and Sophie, to blood. The word hung in the air. Blood. He might as well have pointed a finger at me and shouted, "Imposter." The humiliation was a physical blow, a hot, searing wave that washed over me. The world went fuzzy at the edges. I could feel the pitying glances, the awkward shifting of feet from those around me. In that one moment, with one word, he had publicly, definitively, and irrevocably cast me out. He had drawn a line in the sand, placing his biological children on one side and me on the other. Alone. My mother, Eleanor, must have seen the look on my face. She glided over to me and placed a cool hand on my arm. "He gets a bit sentimental at these things, dear," she whispered, her voice a placating balm that only salted the wound. "You mustn't take it so personally." Mustn't take it personally? He had just announced to our entire extended family that I was not, and never could be, a part of his legacy, that I was in essence a temporary guest whose 28-year stay was a matter of polite tolerance, not love. I pulled my arm away from her touch. "I have to go," I mumbled, my voice choked. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked away from the veranda, away from the polite applause, away from the man who called himself my father. As I walked to my car, the sound of their laughter and celebration followed me, a cruel counterpoint to the shattering silence in my own heart. The drive home was a blur of tears and rage. Not the hot, quick-burning rage of a tantrum, but a deep, cold fury that had been simmering for 28 years. The finality of it all was what broke me. There was no more hoping, no more trying. The door had been slammed in my face and bolted shut. I got back to my apartment, my sanctuary, the one place on earth that was truly mine. I sank onto my couch, the curated catalog from my exhibit still in my handbag. It felt pathetic now, another failed attempt to prove my worth. His words echoed in my head, my true legacy, carried on by my blood, over and over again. It was an obsession, a brand. He was obsessed with blood. Fine. A thought, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, pierced through my grief. He wanted to talk about blood. Fine. Let's talk about blood. For years I had resisted the urge to search for my birth family. I had told myself it was out of loyalty to the Mitchells, a fear of hurting their feelings. What a joke. What feelings? My loyalty had been a one-way street, and I had just reached the dead end. Now there was nothing holding me back. I was untethered, free. My hands were shaking, but my resolve was steel. I opened my laptop, the screen illuminating my tear-streaked face. I bypassed the articles and blogs and went straight to the website for a major DNA testing company. I filled in my details, my credit card information a blur. I selected the most comprehensive package they offered. It wasn't about finding a new family anymore. It was about finding myself. It was an act of defiance, an act of rebellion. As I clicked confirm purchase, I whispered the words into the empty room. You want to talk about blood, Richard? Let's find out where mine really comes from. The 2 weeks I waited for the DNA kit to arrive were strangely peaceful. A profound shift had occurred within me since the reunion. The desperate, pleading part of my soul had gone quiet, replaced by a calm, waiting stillness. I stopped answering calls from the Mitchells. Eleanor left a few voicemails, her tone shifting from her usual placid condescension to a slightly irritated edge. Amelia, your father was disappointed you missed Sunday dinner. You know how he values family routine. Please call me back. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the hurt he had caused. It was as if the toast had never happened, or worse, as if my reaction to it was an inconvenience to them. It only solidified my resolve. I was done with their routines, their expectations, their conditional acceptance. When the small box finally arrived, my heart hammered against my ribs. I followed the instructions with clinical precision, swabbing my cheek, sealing the vial, and placing it in the prepaid mailer. Dropping it into the mailbox felt like launching a message in a bottle into a vast, unknown ocean. I had no idea what would come back to me, if anything. The next few weeks of waiting for the results were a different kind of torture. It was a period of intense self-reflection. I looked at old photographs, searching my own face for clues of a history I didn't know. My features were a mystery. My olive skin, my dark, curly hair, my brown eyes. They stood in such stark contrast to the fair-skinned, straight-haired, blue-eyed Mitchells. For 28 years, I had been a question mark in a family of declarative statements. Finally, the email arrived. The subject line was simple, yet it made my breath catch in my throat. Your DNA results are ready. I sat at my small kitchen table, my hands trembling so much I could barely control the mouse. I clicked the link and was taken to a secure portal. My dashboard lit up with a pie chart of my ethnicity estimates, a mix of Southern European, mainly Spanish and Italian. It was interesting, but it wasn't what I was looking for. I navigated to the tab that read DNA relatives. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. And then I saw it. The page loaded, and a list of names appeared, ranked by the amount of shared DNA. My eyes scanned past the second and third cousins, searching for something closer. And there, at the very top, was a name that made the world tilt on its axis. Peter Mitchell. Predicted relationship, first cousin. I stared at the screen, my mind refusing to process the words. Mitchell, how? How could I have a first cousin named Mitchell? My adoption was closed. My papers said I was a Jane Doe. This had to be a mistake, a system glitch. I clicked on his profile. It was public. There was a picture of a man in his late 20s, smiling on a boat. I didn't recognize him, but as I scrolled down, I saw his family tree information. Father George Mitchell, mother Catherine Mitchell. George, I knew that name. George Mitchell was my father's, Richard's, estranged older brother, a black sheep who had been excommunicated from the family decades ago, for reasons no one ever spoke of. If George was my uncle, then his son Peter was my first cousin, and if George was my uncle, that meant his brother Richard, the man who had raised me, was my father, my biological father. The air left my lungs in a whoosh. It didn't make any sense. None of it. Why would they adopt me if I was their biological child? Why would they lie? Why the elaborate story about being a foundling? And why, for the love of God, would they treat their own flesh and blood with such cold, persistent disdain? The toast, my blood. Did he know? Did he say those words knowing I was his daughter, making the rejection even more pointed, more cruel? Or was it possible that he didn't know? My mind was a whirlwind of impossible questions. My entire life, my entire identity, was built on the foundation of being an outsider. Now that foundation had crumbled, revealing a truth that was even more confusing and painful. I wasn't an outsider at all. I was one of them. I needed to know more. I needed proof beyond a shadow of a doubt. I knew I couldn't confront Richard or Eleanor. They would deny it, stonewall me, accuse me of lying. I needed an undeniable piece of the puzzle, a control subject. I needed Sophie's DNA. Getting it wouldn't be easy. I hadn't spoken to her since the reunion, but I knew my sister. Sophie was vain, self-absorbed, and deeply competitive. I formulated a plan. I called her, my voice breezy and light, betraying none of the turmoil raging inside me. "Hey Soph, it's me." There was a suspicious pause on the other end. "Amelia, I'm surprised you're calling." I launched into my prepared speech. I know. Listen, I was just doing this fun thing online, one of those Ancestry DNA kits. It tells you all about your heritage. I thought it would be so cool for us to do it together. You know, see the breakdown of the Mitchell family genes. I bet you're like 90% British aristocracy or something. I could almost hear her preening through the phone. "Oh really? I have heard about those," she said. Her interest peaked. Daniel would probably be more interested in that sort of thing than me. "Oh come on," I pressed. "It'll be our thing, a sisterly bonding experience. I'll even buy you a kit." That was the hook. The combination of vanity, competition, and a freebie was irresistible to Sophie. She agreed. I immediately ordered another kit and had it sent to her lavish apartment. The wait for her results was the most excruciating period of my life. Every day I checked the site, my stomach in knots. I was terrified of what I would find, and even more terrified of what I wouldn't. What if I was wrong? What if there was a simple explanation, and I was just spiraling into paranoia? Then one rainy Tuesday afternoon, I got the notification. "Sophie Mitchell's results are in and have been linked to your profile." This was it. I took a deep breath, said a silent prayer to a God I wasn't sure I believed in, and clicked the link to compare our DNA. The page loaded. At the top, in bold, clear letters, were the words I will never forget, as long as I live. Amelia Mitchell and Sophie Mitchell. 0% shared DNA. Not related. I think I stopped breathing. I read the words again and again. 0%. Not a single shared strand of DNA. We were not sisters. We were not related in any way. But my test had already proven that I was a Mitchell, which could only mean one thing. Sophie was not. The adored daughter, the cherished legacy, the princess of the Mitchell dynasty, was an imposter. And I, the unwanted stray, the charity case, was the true heir. The irony was so immense, so staggering. It was almost comical. For 28 years, Richard Mitchell had worshipped at the altar bloodline, all while scorning his own blood and cherishing a stranger. The pieces of the puzzle began to slam into place, creating a picture of breathtaking deception. The coldness, the distance, the constant reminders of my adopted status. It wasn't just because I was adopted. It was a lie, a cover-up, a secret they had kept for 28 years. My mind raced back to the scraps of information I had. St. Jude's Hospital. My birthday. Sophie was born on the same day, in the same hospital. It couldn't be a coincidence. I wasn't adopted. I was switched at birth. The story they told me, about finding a baby, abandoned at the hospital, was the lie they were told, or the lie they created to explain my presence. They had been given the wrong child, and they must have found out. When? How? Did they know from the beginning, or did something happen years later that revealed the truth? And what did they do? Instead of trying to find their real daughter, instead of trying to find me, they buried the truth. They raised Sophie as their own, pouring all their love and resources into her, while keeping me, their actual daughter, at arm's length. I was a constant living reminder of their secret, their failure, their lie. My very existence was an inconvenience. The rage that filled me was pure and white-hot. It burned away all the years of sadness and self-doubt. They didn't just neglect me. They had actively erased me from my own life, from my own identity. They stole my birthright and gave it to someone else, and then punished me for it every single day. The search was no longer about just finding my origins. It was about reclaiming my life. I started digging, fueled by a righteous fury I had never felt before. I spent hours on ancestry websites, cross-referencing Sophie's DNA with public databases. It didn't take long. Her DNA showed a strong connection to a family named Rosario, a family with deep roots in our city. I found a public profile for an Isabella and Mateo Rosario. They had a son, Leo, who was 26, and according to public records, they had a daughter, born on my birthday, who had tragically died of a sudden illness in the hospital a day after her birth. They were given ashes. They never got to hold their baby girl. My heart ached for them. They had been grieving a child who was alive and well, living a life of unimaginable privilege, just a few miles away. And their real daughter, the baby they thought they had lost, was me. I now held a truth so powerful, it was like holding a live grenade. It could destroy multiple families, shatter multiple lives. For a moment I hesitated. Did I have the right to do this? To blow up Sophie's world? To confront the Rosarios with a miracle that was also a 28-year-old wound? But then I thought of Richard's face as he made that toast. I thought of the lifetime of cold shoulders and dismissive words. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the truth. The Rosarios deserved to know their daughter was alive. And the Mitchells deserved to face the consequences of their choices. They had built their entire world on a lie about blood. It was time for a blood test. I had to find a way to confront them, but not on their turf, not in their house, where they held all the power. I needed neutral ground. I needed a witness. I needed a lawyer. My hands were steady now as I picked up the phone. I wasn't the scared, pleading girl anymore. I was a woman who knew her own name. I found a top-rated family law attorney in the city, a woman with a reputation for being a shark. I booked a consultation. Then I began to compose an email. The recipient was Richard Mitchell. The subject line was concise and brutal, a matter of paternity and the Mitchell family trust. In the body of the email, I laid it all out, attaching the password-protected DNA reports for myself and for Sophie. I ended the email with a simple, non-negotiable statement. My lawyer will be in touch to schedule a meeting. You will want to be there. I hit send. The grenade had been thrown. Now all I could do was wait for the explosion. The response was faster than I could have imagined. Within an hour, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I knew who it was. I let it go to voicemail. A few moments later, a message appeared. It was from Richard's personal lawyer, a man named Arthur Vance, whose firm had handled the Mitchell family's affairs for half a century. His voice was strained, stripped of its usual booming confidence. He stated that he had received my correspondence and that a meeting was imperative. He suggested his office the following afternoon. I replied via text, "My lawyer Jessica Albright will confirm the time and location. I will not be meeting in your office. The discussion will take place at hers." The power dynamic had already shifted. I was no longer the one being summoned. I was the one setting the terms. The next 24 hours were a blur of activity. I met with Jessica, my lawyer. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 40s, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through you. I laid out the whole story, spreading the DNA reports across her polished mahogany desk. She listened intently, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, "has a very, very big problem. And you, Amelia, have a very, very big decision to make." She explained the legal ramifications. The adoption was likely fraudulent, based on false information provided by the hospital, but the real earthquake was the will. She had her team pull the public records for the will of Richard's father, Harrison Mitchell, the patriarch who had built the empire. The language was ironclad, written by lawyers from a bygone era who left no room for ambiguity. The massive family trust, the company, the properties, everything was to be passed down to his son's verifiable blood descendants. Jessica tapped a perfectly manicured finger on the document. "Sophie gets nothing. Daniel gets his share. And you," she looked at me, her eyes glinting. "You get the other half. You are by law, Amelia Mitchell. And you are about to become an extremely wealthy woman." The word wealthy didn't even register. All I could think about was the word Mitchell, Amelia Mitchell. It was my name. My real name. The meeting was set for 3 p.m. the next day. I spent the morning in a state of suspended animation. I thought about the Rosarios, the family who had mourned a daughter they never lost. I knew I would have to contact them, but I couldn't do it until this first battle was over. One war at a time. I dressed carefully for the meeting, not in a power suit, but in a simple, elegant dark blue dress. I didn't want to look like I was playing their game. I wanted to look like myself. As I walked into Jessica's office building, a sense of calm washed over me. I wasn't a girl asking for acceptance anymore. I was a woman demanding a reckoning. They were already there when Jessica escorted me into the conference room. Richard, Eleanor, Daniel, and Sophie. They were seated on one side of the long table, a united front of denial and fury. Richard's face was a mask of thunderous rage. Eleanor looked pale and fragile, her eyes red-rimmed. Daniel, ever the pragmatist, was studying me with a cool, analytical curiosity. And Sophie looked like she was about to shatter into a million pieces. Her face was blotchy from crying, her eyes shooting daggers of pure hatred at me. I took my seat opposite them, next to Jessica. The silence in the room was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Richard spoke first, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't know what kind of sick, twisted game you're playing, but this ends now. My lawyers will tear you apart for this extortion attempt." I didn't flinch. I looked him directly in the eye. "This isn't a game," I said, my voice quiet but firm, resonating in the silent room. "And it's not extortion, it's the truth, a truth you have known or suspected for a very long time." Eleanor let out a small, choked sob. "How could you do this to us? To Sophie? Do this to you?" I felt a surge of the cold fury I'd felt the night of the reunion. What did you do to me? For 28 years, you treated me like a stranger in your home. You made me feel like I was less than, like I was unworthy of the love you gave so freely to them. I gestured towards Daniel and Sophie. I spent my entire life trying to earn my place in a family that was mine by right all along. You talk about blood, Richard. You stood up in front of 100 people and toasted to your bloodline, and you looked right through me. Well, here I am, the blood you were so proud of. Sophie finally erupted. She's lying, Daddy, she has to be lying. This is a trick. She's always been jealous of me. Always, she wants to ruin my life. The DNA doesn't lie, Sophie, I said softly. And the fight seemed to go out of her. She just crumpled in her chair, weeping. Arthur Vance, Richard's lawyer, cleared his throat. He looked haggard, a man who had aged a decade in a day. We ran our own tests, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. As soon as we received the information, the results were conclusive. Amelia is Mr. Mitchell's biological daughter. Sophie is not. The confession hung in the air, sucking all the remaining oxygen out of the room. Richard looked as if he'd been physically struck. His face went from red to a pasty, ashen gray. He stared at me, really looked at me for the first time, and I could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He was seeing the features of his mother, Evelyn, in my face. The truth was undeniable. Jessica chose that moment to slide a copy of Harrison Mitchell's will across the table. As you know, Arthur, she said, her voice crisp, the Mitchell Family Trust is governed by this document, specifically by Article 4, Section 2. She read the words aloud, her voice clear and steady. The entirety of the Mitchell Family Trust, its holdings and estates, shall be passed down in equal shares to the verifiable blood descendants of my son, Richard Mitchell. She let the words sink in. According to the law, and according to your own DNA tests, there are currently 2 such descendants, Daniel Mitchell and Amelia Mitchell. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a world ending. Sophie's weeping subsided into horrified, gulping breaths. She was not a Mitchell. She was not an heiress. Her entire identity, her entire future, had just been wiped out. Daniel, to his credit, looked stunned but not triumphant. He was looking at his parents, a dawning look of disgust on his face, as he began to understand the depth of their deception. Richard stared at the will, as if it were a venomous snake. His legacy, his precious bloodline, it had all been a lie. The legacy he had spent his life protecting was now legally bound to the daughter he had spent his life rejecting. I looked at them, at the ruins of their perfect family, and I didn't feel the triumph I expected. I just felt empty. I had my answer. I had my truth. I didn't do this for the money, I said, my voice quiet. I did this because I needed to know who I am. You built your life on the importance of blood, Richard. I suggest you learn to live with the consequences of yours. I stood up. Jessica, I think we're done here. Without another look at them, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving them to drown in the silence of their shattered legacy. The aftermath of that meeting was like a slow-motion explosion. Sophie, predictably, spiraled. She stormed out of the lawyer's office, screaming accusations of betrayal at her parents, at Daniel, at the world. Her fiancé, whose family was as obsessed with pedigree as the Mitchells, broke off their engagement within a week of the news getting out. The scandal was too much for his pristine family name to bear. Sophie's world, built on the twin pillars of her name and her inheritance, had been demolished, and she had no foundation to stand on. She refused to speak to me, seeing me only as the villain who had stolen her life. Richard tried to handle the situation the only way he knew how, with money. A few days after the meeting, Jessica received a call from his lawyer with a settlement offer. It was a staggering amount of money, a fortune by any normal standard, offered in exchange for me legally relinquishing my claim to the Mitchell name and the inheritance, and signing a non-disclosure agreement, so airtight I wouldn't be able to whisper the name Mitchell for the rest of my life. He was trying to buy my silence, to erase me one last time. Jessica relayed the offer to me, and I told her to refuse it without a moment's hesitation. "Tell him," I said, my voice cold, "that my name is not for sale, not anymore." Eleanor was a different story. She was broken. A few days later, a letter arrived at my apartment, delivered by courier. The handwriting on the envelope was her elegant, looping script. Inside was a single sheet of stationery. It wasn't an apology, not really. It was more of a confession. She wrote about the day at the hospital, about being told their biological daughter had a severe, life-threatening heart defect and was unlikely to survive the night. The next morning, a nurse had come to them with a story of a miracle. Their daughter had passed, but another healthy baby girl, abandoned by her mother, had been in the nursery. The hospital, in a gesture of compassion, had offered them the chance to take me home, to legally adopt me, and spare them the grief. They could say their baby had survived. It was a clean slate. They took the deal. They buried their grief and their secret and took me home. "I tried to love you, Amelia," she wrote, "but every time I looked at you, you were a reminder of the child I lost. It was a cruelty I could never overcome. I know that is my failing, not yours. I have lived with this guilt for 28 years. I read the letter and felt a flicker of something, not forgiveness, but a sad, weary understanding. Her grief had curdled into a quiet resentment, and I had been the target of it my entire life. But the most important meeting was yet to come. With the truth now out in the open, I knew I had to contact the Rosarios. It was the hardest call I have ever had to make. I spoke to Isabella Rosario, her voice warm and kind on the phone. I explained who I was, as gently as I could. I told her I had reason to believe the daughter she thought she had lost was alive. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line, followed by a choked sob. We agreed to meet. I went to their home, a small, modest house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The moment Isabella opened the door, I saw my own eyes looking back at me. Matteo, her husband, stood behind her, his face a mixture of hope and disbelief. They invited me in. Their home was filled with love, with family photos on every surface. I saw pictures of their son Leo, and in a small silver frame on the mantelpiece, a picture of a newborn baby. "That's you," Isabella whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "The only picture we have." For the next few hours we talked. I told them my story, and they told me theirs. They had grieved for me for 28 years. They celebrated my birthday every single year, lighting a candle for the daughter they never knew. The love in that room was so powerful, so pure. It was overwhelming. It was everything I had ever yearned for. It was home. This was my real family, the family of my heart. The Mitchells were my biology, but the Rosarios were my soul. At the end of our meeting, Matteo looked at me, his eyes shining. "We have never stopped looking for you, Amelia," he said. "In our hearts, we always knew you were out there somewhere." 6 months have passed since my world was turned upside down, and then right side up again. Life is different. I legally changed my name to Amelia Rosario Mitchell, a hyphenation that honors both my truth and my history. I accepted my inheritance, not out of greed, but as a form of justice. The first thing I did was set up a foundation in my grandmother Evelyn's name, dedicated to providing legal and financial resources for adoptees searching for their birth families and for victims of hospital negligence. I wanted to turn my pain into a purpose. My relationship with my two families is a study in contrasts. The Rosarios are my everything. I spend weekends with them, learning about the family I never knew, cooking with Isabella in her warm, fragrant kitchen, listening to Mateo's stories. Their son Leo has become the brother I always wished I had, protective, funny, and unfailingly kind. They are healing the broken parts of me, piece by piece, with their unconditional love. The Mitchells are a more complicated picture. Richard remains distant, defeated. The scandal of the switch became public, a juicy story for the local society pages, and the reputation of his precious family name is in tatters. He treats me with a sort of cold, formal respect now, the kind a man gives to a business partner he dislikes, but is forced to deal with. The irony is not lost on me. Eleanor is trying, she's in therapy, and we meet for coffee once a week. Our conversations are stilted, full of unspoken regrets, but she is making an effort to know the daughter she cast aside. I am not ready to forgive her, but I am willing to see where the path leads. Perhaps the biggest surprise has been Daniel. Once the truth was out, something in him snapped. He saw our parents' actions for what they were, cruel and selfish. He has become an unexpected ally, a bridge between me and the wreckage of the Mitchell family. He is disgusted by their decades of lies and has made it his mission to help me navigate the complexities of the family business that is now, in part, mine. And Sophie, or Chloe, as she is now known, using her birth name, her journey has been the hardest. She lost everything: her name, her fortune, her identity. She hit rock bottom, but the Rosarios, in an act of incredible grace, reached out to her. They saw in her the baby they had given away, a victim in all of this just as I was. They have opened their hearts and their home to her, offering her the unconditional love she, too, never really had from the Mitchells, who only ever valued her as a symbol of their lineage. Chloe is slowly, tentatively, building a relationship with them, and with her brother Leo. She and I are not friends. The wound is too deep, but there is a fragile truce between us, an unspoken understanding that we are two sides of the same coin, both scarred by the same lie. I think back to that day at the reunion, to Richard's toast. He meant for it to be my final humiliation, the ultimate declaration of my otherness. But he was wrong. His words weren't a curse. They were a key. They unlocked a prison I didn't even know I was in. They set me on a path to a truth that, while painful, was ultimately liberating. I found my real family, the one that was searching for me all along. And in doing so, I found myself. My legacy isn't the Mitchell name, or the Mitchell fortune. My legacy is the resilience I built in the face of their coldness, the love I found in the warmth of the Rosarios, and the peace I finally made with who I am. My worth was never determined by their approval, and my bloodline doesn't define me. My heart does. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It's been a long and difficult journey, but sharing it helps me heal. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had a moment that completely changed the course of your life? Share your story below, because I believe there is so much strength in our shared experiences. Don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of truth and transformation. Remember that family is defined by love and respect, not just by blood. Thank you for joining me, and I wish you all strength on your own journeys.